Underhill Part 3. An original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Thursday, December 10th. Sarah Bowen's eyes fluttered in the shadow of Joseph's chest, both on their sides with one hand on her swollen stomach. She breathed him in, mind wading through the black to settle on the shores of dream. She stared at the bleached stone of the cathedral's ceiling, sterile white flames flickering angrily around her on the black stage. Her eyes darted around as warmth slithered on her skin. Sweat beaded on her brow and throat as she found the stained-glass window to her left, the pale lady in her brilliant gown, the pale man beside, and their brood. Their gem-colored eyes cut her like razors until she looked down at her own body, furrowing her brows and pulling at the hospital gown clinging to wet skin. She stared and groped at her stomach, flat and smooth as it was the beginning of the year. She swallowed, heart clamoring into her throat as her hands ran across the fabric, jerking it away to stare at her naked stomach. Flat, smooth, empty. Tears welled as she choked on her own voice. The echoes of never-heard cries filled her ears and made her quiver around a silent sob. She sat up on her elbows, the gown falling back down as she stared ahead, mouth quivering and hands tingling with the never-made memory of holding her baby. Her breasts ached with the phantom memory of nursing that never was, her mouth open, and she shut her eyes, hanging her head at the ghost of the smell, his laugh, his silhouette behind her lids. Her eyes creaked open as a shaky breath fell from her nostrils. Lips tight as she lifted the gown again. Her throat closed on a breath, choking the gasp, the sob that wanted to run free. She slid her palm over her stomach, rubbing like she could smear it away and show the swollen hill where her baby was, but it stayed, and stared at her, and mocked her. Her eyes shut as silent tears fell from her lashes, screwing up tighter and tighter as her mouth clamped shut to hold back the cry. She slid back to the stage, one hand still on her empty belly, the others clapped over her mouth, muffling high, strained whimpers. "My baby," she thought when the words failed her. "Why?" Her hand closed in a fist that slid to her chest, eyes still shut and mouth still trembling, her jaw open on what she wanted to be an angry shout, but it was a wail. She cried until her lungs were empty, body squeezing down on her chest until every gasp of air was gone and her cry was a moan. She breathed loud and echoing off the dead stone and vomited another cry, flinging out everything she couldn't manage with words. Words had failed her. They were useless in the face of something so simple that it became infinitely complex. A single point had broken into a universe. Everything had become nothing, and everything else all at once. Grief clawed at the still air, groping at the walls for something real. Anger burned and whirled and beat the ceiling, grasping at every block, every plate, every beam to tear the cathedral down. The cold maw of sadness swallowed her as she shook and retched and sobbed. She gasped, throat burning as her arms came around her stomach, head rolling to one side, then the other. "They took him!" she screamed, dry, stretched lips sticking together as her fingers clawed at her skin, knees drawn up, legs folding to the side. But the cold, the heat, the rage, the desperation all ran out of her with those 3 words, until she lay there, empty, numb, and quiet. She was a living corpse, a breathing body, a living shell. She lay heavy and limp, limbs falling onto one another, head to one side, eyes staring at the bleached walls behind the stage. Her face was blank and still, the only sign of life her breath and blinks. She lay alone and undying for want of death, and time passed her on, and passed on, and on. Something slid under her skin, brushing the palm she'd forgotten was on her stomach. She froze, staring with wide eyes on the black doors and sickly stone. "It's not real. It's just a phantom memory. He's dead, Sarah." But it came again. She jumped up onto an elbow, tearing the gown off and staring at her stomach. Both hands wiped at the skin like it were foggy glass, like she could reach inside and stir it up. She stared and panted, still as a statue. A tiny hand stretched her skin, swiping across her stomach until it found her palm and stayed. She smiled and barked a laugh. From joy, relief, or shock, it didn't matter. Her baby wasn't gone. She pressed on the tiny hand with silent tears, and the second came, finding her other hand. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth, an eighth. She furrowed her brows as they all pushed out, stretching her skin and muscle and scratching her from inside. She gasped and braced her legs, hugging her stomach so they wouldn't tear her open. Tears ran down her twisted, desperate face. Then they were gone. She swallowed, panting, and unwound her arms. A face pressed against her skin. It smiled. Something thick pressed on her cervix, tearing it open with white-hot pain. She opened her mouth to gasp, and a scream stabbed the air, head tossed back as she clawed the wood of the stage. It pushed into the birth canal, groping, scratching, until long, pale fingers slid from between her legs. She flung her face down in time to watch a black-veined hand smack onto the stage, 6 fingers spread wide as her own, as its fingernails dug deep. It pulled, jerking her forward with a scream as something joined the first arm inside. A second hand slithered out of her, wet with mucus and blood as it grabbed the stage. They pulled together, muscles rippling under translucent skin as they dragged her a little further. They stopped and pulled back inside, palms against her walls, as the clawed fingers curled around the outside and pried her open. She gasped and howled an inhuman scream, pushing herself back before she strained to force her legs together, to keep the hands from spreading her apart, spreading her in two. "No!" She squeezed with her legs, hands pushing on her hips, but she wasn't strong enough. Grunts and groans became screams and shrieks and howls as the hands pulled her open. The skin tore, her muscles snapped, her flesh lay open as she flung herself back, smacking her skull on the stage and wailing. Something else pressed on her cervix, twice the size of the arms and unforgiving. The hands pried her apart. Blood sprang from between her legs as her stomach swelled with the shape of a man's back. She pounded her stomach with her fists, lips torn and bleeding, throat raw as she pushed and clawed to get it out, get away, do something other than lay there and die. She pushed. Bitter, desperate tears rolled. She screamed, fingernails prying free as she clawed the stage. She bore down, teeth cracking, voice ripped from her as the hands sunk their nails into her flesh and the head slid into her birth canal. They pushed and pried and strained. Her pelvis caught on fire. Her flesh popped and ripped and tore in bloody spurts as she shook her head, desperately pleading, pushing with all her strength. "No, no, 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 please, God, no!" But she couldn't push hard enough. The hands opened her with a deafening crack and rip. Blood and organs fell from between her legs as the skin and muscle and bone gave way, and the hands and arms and shoulder pried her pelvis open. The body sloughed from her blood and guts as she fell silent, body burning but numb. She stared at the ceiling, her legs rocking, body jerking as the thing crawled out of her with wet smacks to the stage. Its legs came last, sliding in her entrails to kick her legs as it pulled itself away and rose, as a blur at the edge of her vision. It was tall, sliding her intestines from its shoulders as it took a shaky breath, looking around itself. Her eyes drifted to it, staring as her stuttering breath came more and more shallow. It was a child, hard and skinny with bones pressing against his pale skin and black veins. Even in the sterile light of the sconces, that side of the hall, it was red and purple with her blood, its silvery curls almost blonde with it. Then it looked over its shoulder, mouth open in a pant as it faced her. As he faced her, his crystal blue eyes shone and locked with her quivering gaze. He tilted his head and smiled sheepishly like a boy who knows he's accidentally done something wrong. Then it grew. wider and wider until his mouth stretched between each large, misshapen ear like a Halloween mask.
"Mama,"
he said in a high, boyish voice, stepping closer. She widened her eyes, every hair on her skin standing tall, every ounce of what was left of her screaming to live and get away. She pushed fruitlessly with her hands, her legs dead weight as the alien boy stepped over her guts and fell on all fours.
"Mama, Mama,"
he said happily.
"Mama, Mama, Mama."
He crawled over her stomach, still trickling blood, and cupped her breasts with his icy touch, mouth falling and suckling. She craned her neck, trying to breathe, forcing her eyes open wide as she tried to push away. The boy furrowed his brow and shifted, crawling up and pulling his mouth away until he sat on her ribs.
"No, Mama, I hunger."
His voice was as innocent as any other child, but his eyes were deep, like a mountain of ice is tall. He bent in half, bones sliding out of place but never popping, never breaking, until his mouth was at her nipple again, nipping and biting. She grit her teeth as he dug in deeper, breaking the skin and mixing her blood with the milk as she gasped for breath. The boy's weight emptied her lungs, making each breath shorter than the last until her head swam and the bleached walls turned gray. She jolted awake as the teeth dug deeper and he gnawed on her flesh. She threw her arms at him to grab his throat, to punch his head, to throw him away, but they crashed to a stop with the sharp twang of metal. She looked either side, and her wrists were shackled to the stage. The boy bit hard and reared back, taking part of her breast with him. Sarah screamed and thrashed as the world blurred and the boy chewed her raw flesh, blood and milk running down its lips, eyes rolling into its head. It fell down on her again, tearing deeper into her breasts as she screamed and cried, twisting with what little strength she had left, legs flopping dead as the rest of her tried to live. The boy grabbed her breast with both hands, long nails stabbing her and tearing the skin before it jerked up, jolting her over the stage as her breast ripped free in a spray of blood, strands of flesh and yellow memory. She crashed back to the stage, tears dry as her body failed, and lay there, wanting and waiting to die. Her head shook and rocked as the boy shifted to sit on her chest, humming in satisfaction as he sloshed her raw meat into his mouth. Sarah's eyes drifted like a doll without strings, falling on the doorway to the tunnels and the catacombs beside the stage. A pale man stood there in bright, beautiful clothes, red as her blood and hemmed in gold, with a woman beside him, just as pale, with a sapphire gown fringed in silver and bells. They were white as the stone around them, hair like silver and gold, eyes like diamonds and emeralds. The man looked at her and smiled, then leaned into the woman, looking at the swaddled baby in her arms, wrapped in brilliant green and yellow and gold. She let her breast out and held the baby to it, smiling as it suckled.
"Mama,"
the boy said over Sarah as everything dimmed and faded to shadows.
"I hunger still."
His hand tore at her other breast, crushing her ribs and slamming her into the stage, jostling the world to a blur of black. Something loud rang in her ears as the heart of the stage softened, bouncing her back up as she moved. The shackles softened on her skin, and the weight moved from her chest to her hips. The sound came louder and louder, again and again, as she tossed her head, strength slowly coming back to her arms, her body, her legs. She thrashed, but the shackles weren't gone, holding her hands firm either side her head as the creature squeezed her thighs and sat on her hips. She opened her eyes, glaring through the tears, and thrashed, teeth bore as the sound erupted from her mouth.
"Screams. My screams."
She bucked to throw the demon child off her, but it just held her tighter.
"Get off me!"
she screamed.
"Get off me! Don't touch me! My baby, what did you do with him?"
"Sarah, look at me," the creature said with Joseph's voice. She twisted her mouth and brows in a weeping shout, the world a blur through the tears. The shackles were gone. The beast took her face in his hands and held her, leaning in so that she could see him. She jabbed his ribs, pulling a grunt and curse, but he kept close. "Look at me!" he shouted in Joseph's voice, and with his mouth, and eyes, and face. Sarah froze, furrowing her brow as she found his dark eyes, his worry, the little twitching frown he always made when he was afraid.
Joseph?
He nodded with a terrified smile, sighing as he shut his eyes and hung his head. "I'm here, baby. It's over. Whatever it was, it's over." She swallowed and looked down to her stomach, swollen as it was when she went to bed. Joseph lifted himself off her thighs as he kissed her forehead and sat on his feet beside her. She pushed herself up, panting as her eyes darted around the room.
The bedroom. I'm in the bedroom,
she thought.
It was a nightmare.
She breathed the words, and behind the breath came a sob. Tears poured down her cheeks as she grabbed her stomach and stroked the skin.
Joseph.
Before she could say anything else, he was at her side, his hand in hers, their sides together, his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, forcing in air as it all rushed up behind her eyes, twisting her heart and churning her guts. The baby kicked inside, flailing like she had in her dream. She stroked the skin, sniffling as she tried to calm him down, tried to name the things that she saw, but there was too much. Joseph set his hand in hers, humming an old hymn off-key that she'd forgotten. His lips sat near her ear as he pulled her close, pressing their heads together as he stroked her stomach and her shoulder. She turned her head and kissed his temple, nodding her thanks and taking a deep breath. She winced, her ribs panging sharp.
"Did you sit on my chest?"
she asked, trying for a laugh. He shook his head with a quiet sigh, the hymn forgotten as he spoke. "I woke up when you started screaming. Then you were thrashing. I had to hold you down to keep him safe. But I never got near your chest." He kissed her cheek before she slid against him, silent tears still falling as she listened to his heartbeat, fast and hard. She set her hand over it and kissed the bare skin.
"Thank you. I don't know what happened. I just..."
"Was it one you've had before?" he whispered, his hand resting on the back of her head as they began to rock together. She shook her head, tangling their legs together.
"It was..."
Phantom pains rushed her as she saw the demon child rip out from between her legs. Its voice slithered into her ears, sending chills up her back. Fresh tears fell as she saw herself lying there, her baby gone from her stomach, stolen and missing in someone else's arms. Crimson and gold, sapphire and silver, green, yellow, and orange, they flashed in beautiful garments beside the bleached stone, her baby reaching up from the wrap, feeding from another breast.
"It was horrible."
She swallowed down the sob.
"I've never had a dream like this. Never like this. There was... Our baby was... this thing ripped me open and ate me."
Joseph held her closer, pressing his lips to the top of her head as they rocked. "It's over now. Our baby's right here with his amazing mother and his devilishly handsome father." Sarah chuckled and shut her eyes. "Our family's right here. No monsters. Just us and the dark." Sarah sat quiet for a while as Joseph hummed off-key, listening to his steady heart and breathing deeper as the baby stopped pummeling her organs. She breathed in Joseph's scent and kissed his chest, wrapping her arms around his middle and pulling closer. She took a shaky breath as the shadow rose in her mind, the pale shadow, the unseen thing with invisible but sharp eyes beckoning, always beckoning.
"Joe?"
He hummed against her.
What if the darkness is a monster?"
"Well, that's a good thing." She furrowed her brows and looked up at him. He smirked beneath kind eyes. "Darkness is the easiest monster to face. We just have to turn the light on, and it can't enter." Words whispered in her mind that she hadn't thought of in years, but they made her smile as she said them.
And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not.
Joseph smiled wide. There, you see? Even God says so. Tuesday, December 15th. Joseph Bowen shifted his legs over the blanket, sighed, and rolled from one shoulder to the other, turning from the light of the window. His half-lidded eyes darted from the dim light on the open door, past the blur of the room, past the shadow standing in their doorway. He furrowed his brow and smacked his lips, blinking the sleep from his eyes until everything came clear. He looked over his cheeks to the doorway and the figure still standing there. He kept his breathing steady, didn't move, eyes in the shadows as he blinked, hoping it was just a waking dream. But the figure didn't budge. He jumped up, fist balled and raised as he launched at the shadow, and stopped. He swallowed, staring at the shut door. It was never even open, he heard himself think. It was just a dream. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, goosebumps covering his damp skin as the wind whistled outside. He looked through the window at the bending trees and flicked back to the bedroom door. He cleared his throat and headed for the bathroom, turning back to the bedroom door twice before he crossed the distance, black boxer briefs rustling as he went and drank from the tap. He wiped his lips and brushed his hair back, stopping at the doorway and inching past the post. The bedroom door was still shut. The room was still empty. The wind still howled, and Sarah still tossed in her sleep. He stepped into the room and sighed, standing at the edge of the bed as she mumbled, face twitching like she wanted to scream. Her eyes were sunken and dark, bags heavy underneath, lips thin and dry. She was a ghost, a sleepless ghost haunted in her own head. He breathed deeply to keep the tremble out of it, ignoring his damp eyes. Something sharp tapped at the glass. He jumped and stared at the blackbird on the sill. It turned its head, watching Sarah and rustling its feathers against the wind, cawing again and again, tapping the glass and lifting its head, bobbing backward like it was eating. Sarah screamed. Joseph found her face, twisted and warped as she gasped and threw up another shriek. She tossed her head as he jumped on the bed and rolled her on her back. She arched her spine, spreading her legs as he straddled her lap, looping his feet under her thighs and leaving enough room for her stomach.
No, get off me! Don't touch me!
She swung her open hand. He reeled back so it missed his face, but her other came like a claw and scratched his bare chest open. He hissed, hands darting out to catch her upper arm and hold her down. Her hands came up to his shoulders and found the same spot as last night, tearing open the scabs and breaking new skin. He grit his teeth as she thrashed, eyes closed to shut out the look on her face, the look that wasn't Sarah. I have to do this, he thought. I'm not hurting her, I'm keeping her safe, our baby safe. He turned his face to the side as she arched her back and slammed down, bucking under his legs to wiggle free. She drew up against his hands, and when he looked down to see why, he found her face inches from his own. Then she screamed, high as a banshee and long, like her voice was a weapon. It cut into his ears, pushing him back with the jab until he steeled himself and pushed back down. He grit his teeth, straining his neck to look up so that her voice wouldn't go straight into his ears. She stopped. Joseph looked down at her open eyes, irises flitting back and forth like she were still dreaming. He swallowed, something icy settling deep in his guts, dancing up his back like taunting fingers.
You think you can hold me down?
She said in a low voice. Sarah.
You'll never have me, Joseph Bowen.
She spat in his face.
Who are you? A mechanic, son of the failed entrepreneur turned gas station employee, son of a dead mother slit her wrists because she couldn't stand the sight of her pathetic husband.
Sarah. She laughed. Wake up. She laughed louder and higher, smile rising until it couldn't go any further, like it was pulled by strings. Her voice rose, laughter to cackling to shouts to screams.
"Help me!"
She fell back down, tears streaming as she gasped like she'd come up from deep water. She screamed, her legs opening wide, fighting with his and whining. He jumped and looked down, straining to close his thighs with hers. "Sarah, baby, I'm here!" The crow tapped on the glass and cawed as he said it over and over and over again. "I'm here! I'm here with you! Wake up! Come back to me, baby! Come back from the dark!" The bird cawed again and again, its beak rapping the glass, and cawing again and again. The last, though, came low and long like a growl. He looked over his shoulder at it as it hopped on the sill, ignoring the wind until it sat on the closest corner. Its black eyes glinted like knives in the moonlight as it tilted its black head and growled at him. He set his jaw, anger swelling in his belly, boiling up into the rest of him, possessing his mouth. He spat the words through his teeth. "Curse you! Fall from the wind and be crushed on the earth, devoured by the ants and snakes and crawling things!" The crow perked its head up and reared back, rustling its wings as it moved from foot to foot. He turned away and set his lips on Sarah's ear. "Sarah Kristen Bowen, come back to me. Come back to your husband who loves you. Come out of the nightmare." She screamed higher, twisting under his grip and bucking against his hips, but he held her firm. "I'm here, Sarah. I'm right here, always right here." She twisted and groaned, whimpering as her strength waned. "Come back to me." She squirmed, breathless and weeping as she slid her face against his, her mouth falling to his ear and whispering, "You'll never have me." He pulled back and she lurched up, screaming like she'd been stabbed, eyes wide open and staring straight ahead. He panted, heart pounding as his eyes flitted between hers, skin crawling, body burning and cold all at once. Sarah! Sarah, it's over. I'm right here." He let go of her arms so that she could sit up, her mouth closing in a frown as frantic eyes darted around the room. The clouds cleared as she realized where she was, and her brown eyes found his. New tears spilled over as she reached for him and pulled herself into his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, raising to his knees to set his head atop hers. She gasped, trembling against him, goosebumps coming and going in waves as she sobbed. Her breath came sharp and ragged, catching in her throat as she clung to him, fingers hard on his back as he wrapped her tighter, whispering things to her and humming off-key. He rocked her side to side, eyes flicking to the windowsill as the wind whipped around their house in high moans. The crow was gone.
"I'm sorry,"
she said in a broken voice, pulling away and finding his face.
"I'm so sorry you have to go through this."
He cupped her jaw to look her in the eye, but she turned away, sniffling as her hands found his chest and the moonlight, fresh crimson under her nails. "Don't be sorry." Her eyes went wide.
"Oh, God, is that blood? Did I—"
She found his face again, darting over it and away with trembling lips. "Don't worry about it." She found the scratch on his chest and covered her mouth, then his shoulder, and the dried trails falling down his arms. "You were asleep and out of your mind with the nightmare. I'm okay."
"No, you're not. I hurt you."
She sat back, her mouth turned down in an angry frown.
"I hurt you, Joe. What if I hurt our baby, our boy?"
She looked down at her stomach, one hand covering her mouth and the other stroking the skin.
"God, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry you have a crazy mommy."
Her voice trailed off into breath and tears. "Hey," he grabbed her face, forcing their eyes together. "You are not crazy."
"But—"
"You're not your mother. We love each other. You love our son, and you would never do anything to hurt him. I know you're terrified you'll abandon him like your mom did your brother, but you're not her." He smiled despite it all. "The day you abandon him and I is the day I sprout wings and dance the can-can for Broadway." She smiled sadly, wiping at her eyes with a small nod. She took a deep breath and nodded one more time.
"You're right."
"Of course I am." She rolled her eyes and set her hands on his, finding his gaze.
"But I'm still sorry you have to hold me down and listen to screams before work." "You'll never have me,"
the voice echoed in his skull. "You can't control your dreams, Sarah. Besides, remember our vows?"
"Richer or poorer, better or worse."
"Forever and ever, till death do us part." He smiled wide and kissed her forehead, pressing them together so they had to look at one another's eyes. "I'm afraid you're stuck with me. So, I'll hold you down and wake you up and hold you through the tears, even if you feel bad for it. I love you, honeybee. I'm here, and you're stuck with me." She nodded with a weak smile and kissed his mouth, hand going to his side and hip as she patted his leg.
"This is probably bad timing."
"Bathroom?"
"Bathroom."
He stood and checked the windowsill again before Sarah waddled across the room and sighed from the toilet. He chuckled even as she protested.
"It's not funny."
"I know. But it sort of is."
"Jerk."
She chuckled. "Love you too." His smile didn't reach his eyes as he faced the window and stared at the sill, crossing his arms and grinding his teeth.
"You'll never have me, Joseph Bowen,"
the voice whispered through his mind.
"Who are you? A mechanic?"
Wednesday, December 18th. Sarah lay on her side, careful not to let Joseph wrap his arms around her, eyes peeking through the lashes to study his face. His shoulders rose and fell slower and slower until his mouth drooped and sputtered in sleep. She rolled onto her other shoulder and stilled, letting the air settle as Joseph adjusted to the loss of her smell and heat, then slid her legs from under the blanket. She sat up, hand on her stomach as the baby jumped and headbutted her stomach. She shut her eyes and stroked the skin, steadying her breath until her son calmed within her.
"Soon,"
she thought.
"You'll be out soon. Then I can finally rest."
She stood, wool pajamas sliding together as she waddled across the room, ignoring her bladder to open the bedroom door, leaving it cracked behind her. She sighed and waddled a little faster to the stairs, clumsily taking them one at a time as her bladder screamed.
"There's probably nothing in there,"
she thought, scoffing as she finally made it to the floor. She rounded the banister to the downstairs bathroom and sighed at the trickle that felt like a flood. She stretched, ignoring the face in the mirror and the dark circles around her deep-set eyes.
"A few sleepless days and some naps are better than that."
She sighed and went to the kitchen, turning on the light over the stove and the kettle, holding her fingers above the glass and humming at the heat. She set about the routine she'd crafted the last 2 days, drinking tea after tea, tidying up everything, organizing the pantry and kitchen, and moving on to alphabetize the books in the living room. But her back and feet and hips screamed at her, so she sat on the couch with her feet up. Cold lunch meat was rolled on a plate beside her as she surfed the television through infomercials, soap operas, kids shows, televangelists, and horror movies. She yawned and checked the time, groaning that it had only been 2 hours.
"God, I miss coffee."
She laid her head back on the couch and chuckled to herself, eyes falling shut.
"No, I miss sleeping more. I don't know how people go days without sleep. This is as close to hell as I think I want to get,"
she thought, yawning.
"I should take a nap so I'm not so totally out of it."
She nodded, adding aloud,
"My alarm's set for 10 minutes. It should be enough to rest without dreaming."
She laid back and let herself sink into the couch, feet up and apart, television glowing over her slack face as she muted it on instinct.
"Just a few minutes,"
she slurred.
"It won't be long enough to dream."
The light on the other side of her lids swirled and swam in the dark, like a hand motioning her closer. She breathed deeply and let herself slip down into Morpheus's hands in the dark and cold, until she opened them on the bleached stone of the cathedral's ceiling. She looked down and saw her flat stomach, She wailed and cried. She gasped and filled the hall with mourning. She laid like a corpse, defeated and waiting for the final end. She felt the handprint beneath her own. She saw the pair, the second, the third, all pressing up and wanting free. Her heart raced, throbbing in her ears as she pushed the smiling face in her stomach down, as she screamed and gasped. She arched her back as something slid out of her. She screamed and pushed herself back with her arms as the sharp eyes watched from the stained-glass window. She vomited inhuman sounds and lurched as the six-fingered hand slithered out from between her legs, as its claws grabbed at the black wood floor, as it pulled and jerked her down the stage. She screamed higher and higher as memory came into dream. The pale boy would rip her open, would crawl out of her soon-to-be corpse, would devour her. She screamed and thrashed and trembled as she watched memory come to life. She screamed at the boy's touch, at his smile, at his voice.
"Mama."
The whispered words multiplied into a choir, swimming around her, through her, every letter biting like hundreds of little teeth. She sat up, wailing as the cathedral twisted, fading into a double image, its colors and shapes molding into her living room. She panted, looking around as the bleach-white stone flared and fell over reality, or maybe the living room was the dream, and she was in hell already. She felt between her legs.
"It's not true, never true, just a dream, a dream!"
But her hand came away wet. She turned on the lamp and stared at her gray bottoms, her voice frozen, beating against her teeth as she panted, eyes wider and wider until all the world was white stone and a hand slithered into her pant leg. She screamed and pushed back, rising half up the back of the couch as the demon boy's voice whispered behind her, chanting for her, telling her how hungry he was. "Babe!" Joseph's voice came through her own screams. "Sarah, where are you?" His steps pounded upstairs. Then the banister. He flew down the steps in a blur at the edge of her vision, stumbling and slamming into the wall with a curse and a thud. He raced over, eyes wide and holding his shoulder as he looked her over.
"It's real!"
she screamed.
"The dream! The hand! Joseph, I'm bleeding! It's coming! It'll rip me open! I'm gonna die!"
Joseph looked her over again, settling on the dark spot between her legs, and took her hand with a bitter smile. "It's okay. Sarah, honey, it's okay. Your water broke."
"What?"
She flicked up at him, his face steely calm despite the buzzing beneath the black of his eyes.
No, I can't. I'm not ready."
She squeezed his hand hard, leaning forward, heart in her throat, tears streaming over her cheeks as the waking and dreaming bled together, the warm colors of her living room morphing into the white stone and back again.
"I can't."
He took her face with his hand and smiled wide. "We're gonna have a baby, Sarah." He kissed her forehead and squeezed her hand. But when he pulled away, his face shifted in front of her, skin paling, eyes turning silver blue, dark hair waving long and loose and silver. The pale man smiled over Joseph's face, and their mouths moved together with Joseph's voice. "Let's get you ready. We need to get you to the hospital." She stared, eyes wide, blinking hard as her mouth screwed up into a sob. But the pale face was gone, and Joseph gave her a sad smile, kissing her one more time. "I'll go get everything ready. Stay here and I'll help you to the car." Then he was gone, rushing with a limp, half tripping on his own feet as he raced around the house for the bag they'd prepared last week. She grabbed her stomach and gasped, grunting as her body bore down.
No, no, no,"
she whimpered to herself.
"God, not like this. Please don't let it be like the dream, not like that."
She shut her eyes and lay against the back of the couch, breathing, rubbing her stomach for an eternity before it tightened with the next contraction. She groaned, curling up, breath locked in her chest as she opened her mouth in a silent shout. It stopped. She fell back like a doll, breath falling out of her as she tried to catch it again. Then Joseph was there, taking her hand, another on her back helping her sit up and stand and guiding her to the car. His voice mumbled in her ear, fighting over the roar of her blood and the pound at her temples as she half closed her eyes.
"This is real,"
she reminded herself, shutting her eyes to catch her breath as Joseph opened the car door and helped her slide in.
"This isn't a dream. That was the dream. My baby's real. He's real."
The sickly hand jolted through her thoughts, shocking her eyes open as Joseph threw the bag into the back seat and hopped in the front, revving the engine and setting them down the road. Sarah sat back, her legs tight and grinding together as her fingers kneaded her waistband.
"I'm soaked. What about my bottoms?"
she hissed, head going back as she narrowed her focus on breathing.
"That was just a dream. This is real. It's just my baby. Just my son," she thought. "Mama!"
The baby's voice ripped through her, drawing out new tears as it rang over and over, higher and louder.
"That was just a dream,"
she breathed to herself. "Babe, they're not going to care. They've seen worse," he chuckled, stroking her hand with his thumb. "You'll get a gown anyway, okay?" She panted, smiling weakly as she nodded and looked over at him. He smiled and brought her hand to his lips before returning to the road. She froze as they passed the pale man. Robes as extravagant as before, skin like stainless steel in the streetlights. She followed him as they drove past, his almost white eyes locked with hers as he smiled, a calm, genuine smile that looked so out of place on his sharp, inhuman face.
"Just a dream,"
she reminded herself. But the man walked toward them up ahead as they turned onto a fork in the road, his arms forward with the green and yellow swaddled baby, offering it in the air. She swallowed, then reeled forward in a shout as her body went taut. She growled, baring her teeth as she spread her legs and fought the push.
How much further?"
she screamed, then fell back, panting and choking on her own breath as the demon child's face appeared above her.
"I'm hungry, Mama."
She jumped and turned away, fighting the scream in her chest and saving it for when she delivered her real baby.
"How much further?"
she shouted at Joseph, his knuckles grinding together in her hand, ignoring the crimson and gold flashing under the streetlights across the street, ignoring the pale man's gaze and the baby he held out for her. "Not long," Joseph answered, stepping on the gas. "The road's pretty empty, so we'll make it there in a few minutes."
"We better. I am not the woman who's giving birth to her baby in the back seat."
"You won't be, babe, I promise." They pulled into the hospital parking lot as another contraction doubled her over. The car screeched in front of the automatic doors. Joseph leapt out and rounded the car, opening her door and reaching for her hand as the contraction ended. Sarah caught her breath, taking his hand and slowly crawling to her feet, panting and freezing as the pale woman appeared beside the doors. Her sapphire gown and silver hems were darker than the night against her white skin and golden hair, her jade eyes following them above her quaint, perfect smile. Joseph pulled Sarah on. "Come on, babe. Baby on the way, remember?"
"I remember,"
she snapped and sighed, stepping closer and swallowing as they passed the woman, her hands outstretched with the green and yellow bundle. The baby inside cried, and Sarah's heart sank into her guts. It was bloody murder, begging for her, desperate for her. Everything inside said to run for it and sweep it out of the pale woman's arms and hold it close, to put it to her breast, to cradle and coddle it, to sing it to sleep and make it warm and happy and loved. "Babe, you okay?" Joseph said. She blinked and nodded, stepping forward against the tears as they entered the second set of doors. They rushed to the desk, Sarah panting, her eyes wide and the world blurring away, the sterile white and blue of the hospital merging with the cathedral, the baby bleating behind her, getting closer and closer as the pale woman approached. "Pregnant. We need a doctor." Joseph's voice came in through the static in her ears as her body tensed and she doubled over, catching the counter and smearing it with the mucus and blood. She grunted, catching her jaw and swallowing the scream, face pulled back as she squeezed her eyes hard enough to see color in the black. It stopped and she vomited her breath, gasping for more as the nurse's voice went over the intercom, then a rush of people. She was sitting and being pushed into a room, then helped on a bed as another contraction gripped her. A doctor tried to speak with her and settled on Joseph as she bore down in the bed, staring wide-eyed and crying as the pale woman watched her at the foot. The baby was at her breast, screeching and howling inhumanly, arm reaching up, pink and helpless. She tore it away from her teat, holding it out over Sarah's feet with a tilt to her head, grinning with too many slender teeth. The contraction ended and Sarah sunk into the bed. The pale woman was gone. But she blinked, and the pale woman hovered over her face as though they stood in front of one another. Sarah screamed and thrashed. Nurses grabbed her, held her down as time sped and slowed in rhythm with her heartbeat, blinking between the room and the cathedral. In one came her baby, in the other came the child.
Mama?
The boy said with his back to her, then flicking like corrupted film to see her face.
Mama, I hunger.
He smiled wide and wider until his face should have torn in two. Then he crawled over the foot of her bed, clammy hands running over her stomach as a man spread her legs.
No!
Sarah screamed as the cathedral faded away and the hospital room changed. Her head went back as she fought the restraints, head rolling to find Joseph. He stood at her side, looking between her legs and the doctor. She cried and swore and screamed as another contraction racked her, pulling her head down to face the smiling, hungry thing as it crawled out over her stomach and sat on her breastbone. She screamed and shook her head again and again, push after push, scream after scream, until the visions died and the fire between her legs ended with a pop and slick. She collapsed into the bed, panting, eyes half-lidded as her loins throbbed and the burn settled, goosebumps blanketing her as cool numbness flooded over her body. Joseph smiled wide and laughed. "It's our boy, baby. He's beautiful." "A perfectly healthy baby boy." The doctor's voice echoed somewhere else. "Would you like to see him, miss?" She stared up at Joseph, ready for the pale man or the demon boy or something else. But it was just him. Just his smiling face beaming with all the joy of a new father. She grinned up at him, panting.
Our son, he's okay?
"Take a look," Joseph said. There was a smack, then the room filled with cries. His voice. Sarah's eyes came open a little more as she turned to the sound and found a nurse coming close with a baby. Her baby. Her son. He cried and wriggled in the nurse's arms, pink and wiped down and angry at everyone for taking him out of the warmth. She smiled wide and found his feet, counted his 10 toes, and picked up her hand, stopping because of the restraints. "Can we get these things off now?" Joseph barked around a curse. "Yes, of course," the doctor said, and nurses undid the restraints, letting her lift a trembling hand to her boys. He felt her warmth and latched on, his cries lower but still growling at the world. He squeezed hard and Sarah smiled, eyes falling shut as the darkness washed her and she fell back from the waking world.
My Riley.
The world and darkness fluttered together in front of her eyes, changing places and circling one another until she blinked. The room came into focus, simple beige and blue with one chair near the hospital bed and a track of curtains pulled together against the wall. "Beep, beep, beep," came something beside her. She swallowed dryly and cleared her throat as she looked over at the monitor, green lines jumping regularly as the nurse looked over the screen. He was a tall, skinny thing, and young, no older than herself, with his long hair braided between his shoulder blades. She pushed herself up, opening her mouth to speak and only gasping at the sharp jab between her legs. She fell back against the pillows, body stiff as she waited for the pulsing sting to ease into an ache, to a bruise, or to nothing. The nurse never turned, checking the saline bag as Sarah sighed and let her body sink into the bed.
That's right,
she thought.
I had a baby. Gonna be a bit tender. Hello?
The word was hollow and broken from her dry throat. She cleared it and swallowed.
Hello? How long have I been asleep?
She turned her head to the nurse and furrowed her brows.
I've been asleep,
she thought.
And no dreams.
She smiled.
It's finally over. Excuse me?
She continued aloud.
How's my son? My husband, can you tell him I'm awake? Can I see Riley? Where is he?
She looked to the door, smile wide as the weight on her chest dissolved. The nurse stopped and stared at the corner of the room, arms falling to his side, body frozen like stone. He turned. But when he faced her, he wasn't the nurse. He didn't morph or change or shift. He didn't flicker or twitch. One moment, he was human. And the next, reality blinked around him, and the pale man faced her. Her eyes went wide and she clambered away, wincing but pushing back anyway until she sat up, back against the side rail, legs nearly over the edge. She stared at him, silence thickening the air and sitting in her chest like cement.
"Where's my son?"
He tilted his head, face expressionless but not cruel.
"What did you do to him?"
The pale man smiled like a father after his child asks a silly question. He inclined his head, pale silvery eyes fixed with hers as he pointed to her chest. She turned her head to the side, eyes glued to him, but he didn't move, stuck like a marble statue in crimson robes. She swallowed, flicking down to her chest and back up at him, as if her gaze would keep him frozen, and she went rigid. Something was at her chest, in her arms, against her skin. Its silhouette merged with hers. Its warmth bled into her. Its mouth suckled at her breast. She swallowed and let her eyes fall, finding a little baby wrapped in cream blankets. He set one free hand on her breastbone as he suckled and drank her milk. Her heart opened, smile spreading as she pulled the blanket away from his face, studying him, every crease, hill, and fold. Little black hairs sprouted from the crown of his head. His little ears were pressed flat. His eyes bulged from his face under wrinkly lids. She pulled him closer and helped him latch onto her breast until he stilled and sucked. The pale man stood straight in her peripheral vision, banishing the warmth like wintry winds as the reality of the room struck. She swallowed and steeled her arms around Riley, slowly arching her head up to find him standing there, the gold trim glinting in the sterile light and dripping with precious baubles and tasseled chains. His arms were wrapped around a bundle of green and yellow fabric, bright and brilliant as sunrise and springtime leaves, his white face downturned and smiling. He flicked his eyes to her, holding the same smile as he hoisted the baby up and motioned to it with his head.
"Mine? I didn't have twins, right?"
she thought. He smiled down at her, eyes drifting to Riley with a tilt of his head like he were the father. The baby in his arms reached through the fabric, its 6-fingered hand swiping for him, dark veins crisscrossing beneath. She stared at it, mouth dry as she pushed herself further against the rail with her legs. He moved the baby closer, still near his chest. 2 arms came from her right, long, slender white fingers with curved, manicured claws. Sarah turned, wincing at the pain as she sat up and faced the pale woman, her sapphire gown sleek and close to her bodice, the silver bells chiming like laughter at her hips and shoulder and feet. Her golden hair fell loose over her shoulders as she smiled, a human smile, a genuine smile that reached her emerald eyes. Human as it was just as alien sitting on her chiseled features, smooth and elegant but strong and unforgiving. Her fingers slid around Riley, cool to the touch as she brushed Sarah's skin and leaned closer, smelling of dirt and cinnamon. Sarah clung to her son, shaking her head as she flicked back and forth between the man and woman, both smiling. The pale woman laced her sapphire-covered arms between Riley and Sarah's breast, nodding as Sarah sat straight and held firm.
"No. What are you doing?"
The pale woman tilted her head and stopped, kind, sharp eyes falling from Sarah to Riley and back again before she moved away, baby in grasp. Sarah squeezed her fingers into the blanket, leaning against the woman's constant retreat. She shook her head, gasping against the pain in her gut, her loins, her body burning with an invisible bruise. The pale man stepped forward, drawing her eye. Her grip loosened for a second, but it was enough. The pale woman scooped Riley up into her arms. Sarah turned, reaching out to grab him as the pale man set the other baby to her chest. She looked down, ready for the veiny skin, the white eyes, the inhuman smile whispering about its hunger, and saw Riley. His pink skin, ears flat to his skull, sprigs of black hair on his head. He squirmed in her grasp, eyes squeezing as he opened his mouth and reached for her breast. The pale woman smiled, wide but still human, rocking the other baby in her arms and brushing his cheek with her curved nail. Sarah looked back to Riley in her arms, then up at the pale man, and jumped back at Joseph instead, wincing and catching the side rail. She flung her arms up to catch the baby, but when she looked down, he was gone.
"Where is he?"
She found Joseph's black eyes, brows furrowed and mouth cutting into an open frown as she looked to her right and found nothing.
"Where's Riley?"
Joseph smiled and sat beside her, hand on the side of her face as he leaned in and kissed her forehead. "He's asleep now, but they can bring him in now that you're up." His face glowed around his smile. Even his eyes twinkled with invisible stars. Parents. I still can't believe that we're parents. He chuckled to himself and found her eyes again. "How are you holding up?"
"Joe, was I asleep when you came in?"
He furrowed his brow and sat straight. I don't know. You were sitting up, but your eyes were shut. Then you opened them when I got close." He shrugged. "You could have been asleep." She swallowed and studied his face.
"Is Riley okay?"
He nodded.
"You've seen him? Touched him? Does everything look all right? Normal? Good?"
He laughed half nervously and nodded, taking her hand. "Our son's perfectly healthy. Nothing abnormal in the slightest." He swept his hand through the air with a nonchalant smile, hunching as he laced their fingers. "He's fine, I promise. How are you, though?" She licked her lips and sighed, shutting her eyes as she fell back against the pillows.
"Better, I guess. I mean, I just gave birth, so not great, but I'll live."
She smiled with a breathy laugh that became a wince. She found his eyes as the pain faded, eyebrows turned up in the middle as he looked her up and down. She squeezed his hand.
"I'm fine, babe, really. Just tired. Some bad dreams."
Not the same one, right? She shook her head and sighed deeply, eyes trailing over the mounds of her knees under the blanket.
"Different one this time. Brand spankin' new. No blood or guts, though."
She found his face and smiled. "Do you want me to get you some water?" She shook her head.
"Maybe in a bit. Right now, just stay with me."
He smiled and kissed her lips. "Always." Hey y'all, thanks for making it to the end. If you liked the video, let me know by dropping a comment and liking the video. Bold concept, I know. If you like what I do, then hit the sub button and ring the bell so you don't miss my uploads every other Friday. And hey, if you know someone who loves stories, give this a share. It'd be greatly appreciated. See y'all next time.